everybody. So that was very kind. Thank you very much. So I was the Chief Technology Officer at Priceline.com, and yes, William Shatner is exactly how he comes across. So that's usually the number one question I get is not about how we built the system or any of those things. It was, what did you think of William Shatner? So I'm the CEO of the Startup America Partnership. We're focused on really raising America's entrepreneurial game to the next level. And it's really critical. A lot of people often talk about America falling behind. The reality is that the rest of the world, 95% of the human population, is catching up. And that's a good thing for all of us, but it means that we need to step our game up to the next level. And so Startup America was launched earlier this year. It's a private-public partnership with the White House, was launched out of that. We handle the private sector side. We don't take any money from the federal government. We don't work for the federal government. They probably wouldn't let me dress like this, even if I did. We're really focused on rallying the private sector together to help America's startups be more successful. We're really focused on companies that have the ambition to be big companies and to grow. And what we've heard from pretty much all the entrepreneurs throughout the day today is that passion for growth, that idea that we can grow. And the reason that's so important, and the reason that I'm so excited about working on startups is not just because I've only known how to be a member of a startup team or a founder my whole life, but it's because startups are what drives the economy in America. And I'm going to give you one piece of data that's really important, and it's from the Kauffman Foundation. You'll hear more about them in a minute. All the net new jobs created in the United States over the last 30 years were created by companies less than 5 years old. Okay, less than 5 years old. That's what we call startups. They're the ones that grow. And yes, some of them fail, but they're also the ones that grow. And the entrepreneurs that create those companies, the company may fail, but the entrepreneur doesn't go away. They continue to innovate and build new firms and new opportunities, and that's where all the new jobs come from. So when you think about what matters in the United States, if you're trying to grow the economy, you've got to focus on startups. And so if there's one thought that you all leave with, especially those that are from larger companies, it's that these companies, these special firms, are really critical to the overall economy and the overall ecosystem. And we've got to focus mind share on investing on these startups. And there's a difference between small companies and startups. We're talking about startups, young, high growth potential firms. Nothing against small businesses, nothing against large businesses, but it's these young companies that matter most. So Startup America is all focused on bringing resources that can help these young companies be more successful. We're focused on companies that we call startups. These are these young under fives. Ramp-ups, which are companies that are in customer acquisition mode, they're going through growth mode, and we call speed-ups. Those companies that their growth is actually driving the business from the customer side and they're just trying to keep up. And companies go through those cycles. You notice I didn't talk about seed round or Series A or Series B or any of that stuff. Those are the investors talking. What matters is the entrepreneurs. So since you are the ones that matter, I'd like anybody who is starting a company or part of a startup right now to please stand up. Come on, stand up. Late in the day. Okay. Number one, these people are the people that matter. Okay? And if you're sitting down, your job is to help them. Okay, your number one job is to try to do things to help them be more successful, okay? So I start by giving them a round of applause for doing an unbelievable job. It's these founders and starters and joining founding teams, you guys can sit if you'd like, that are going to drive our success. So we're focused on those companies. Our job is to try to bring resources to them in 5 major areas. We're working on expertise. We heard a lot about expertise and network building. Ben talked about the network that he built around him here in Des Moines to help him build his company. We spent a lot of time about support services. That's everything on the back office side of things. Some of the things that BetterWorks does is an example of those kinds of services. Talent. We heard a lot about talent. How do you recruit, retain, bring people into your company? Customers. How do you grow your customers? And then finally, capital. And I always put capital last because the leading indicator that an entrepreneur is out of their depth or doesn't quite know what they're doing is when they say, all I need is money. That's the number one indicator that there's a problem here. We've got to fix that first, because it's usually one of those 4 other things they haven't gotten right. They don't have the talent, they haven't figured out the team yet, they don't know who their customer is. I was terrified when somebody asked earlier today, how many people talked to your customer before you started building your product? And there was like 10% of the entrepreneurs raised their hand. You got to have those other things under control first. And what we're doing is we're bringing large companies, which is why I was so excited about the theme of this conference, large companies into all those categories to help. Companies like Dell, Microsoft, Intuit, American Express, all of which, Google, Ernst & Young, Facebook, all of which can bring assets that can help entrepreneurs be more successful and help your businesses and your startups grow. So what we're doing is working largely with those large companies and then moving to startups, helping other startups. And we're doing that because we think that if we bring those resources to bear, we can help the current class of America's startups kind of raise the bar. So that's the first thing we're doing. Second thing we're doing is we're focused on startup ecosystems. A lot of discussions today about here in Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri. We've got some naturally occurring ecosystems like Silicon Valley and Boston and Austin and New York, but there's unbelievable startup ecosystems happening all around the country. We just had a conference earlier this week in Nashville where we had representatives, mostly serial entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs from 15 different states around the country. Only one representative came in via Skype from Massachusetts. Every place else was places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Connecticut. We've already launched partnerships with entrepreneurs in Connecticut, Illinois, and Tennessee to help raise that game. And we've begun discussions here actually in Iowa in creating the potential for a startup Iowa, with the idea of banding together and focusing on the entrepreneurs, those people in the room that stood up. How do we raise the visibility, which brings me to the third thing that Startup America is all about. We've got to celebrate the richness of our current startups and young companies that are building unbelievable firms right here in the United States. And remember that every city and every state in the United States was created by crazy maniac entrepreneurs. Every one of them were those people. So that's a big part of what Startup America is about, is sort of elevating the visibility of the entrepreneurs that are here. So this conference is all about the connections between large companies and startups. And we've had essentially editions of lots of startups talking and we've had some large companies sort of talking. What I thought I'd do is to spend a little bit of time with you talking about the connectedness, but also brainstorming a little bit with you on some specific ideas. And so to help me to do that, I'm going to bring up one of our key partners, Nick Seguin from the Kauffman Foundation. So Nick, come on up. Let's give Nick a round of applause. So I often talk about entrepreneurs, there's safety in numbers. So I thought I'd bring Nick up here so that in case there were really tough questions, I could make him answer them. And then I could take all the easy softballs. So I thought I'd ask Nick, just to start, how many people here have heard of the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship? Okay, that's great. So you're only going to have to spend like 10 seconds describing what it is. Okay, so just talk a little bit about the Kauffman Foundation, and then I want to introduce the audience here to this idea about what some of the challenges are for young companies and corporations to connect and work together. So.
Yeah, definitely. So first and foremost, Kauffman's based in Kansas City, so part of the Silicon Valley. The foundation was endowed in '93 by Ewing, Marion Kauffman, $700 million then, $2 billion endowment right now. We deploy around $100 million in capital every year in the United States to research and understand at a deeper, more fundamental level this phenomenon of entrepreneurship, and then also to kind of catalyze through programming, through initiatives, through partnerships, as much and more entrepreneurship as we can. It is the economic driver, and so our whole goal, our whole mission is dedicated to this idea of entrepreneurship.
So one of the things that Nick and I have been talking a lot about, and for those in the room, how many people here work for a large company? Still in the room? Okay. So one of the challenges and questions we have for you all is, how many of you have a small or medium business channel? Somebody, a department or a team who's focused on the small and medium business channel? Okay. How many of you have a large corporate channel? Somebody, strategic partners, major salespeople? Okay, and the rest of you didn't raise your hand. Who do you sell to? Consumers? How many have a consumer business? Sell direct through that. Okay. How many of you have a startup channel? Okay, the guys from Microsoft, BizSpark. One of the challenges and one of the opportunities for the large companies in the room is to open up the opportunity to connect with all the startups and to create a channel in your business, ideally someone focused on those firms. They're a special class of firm. For the entrepreneurs in the room, here's a question for you. How many of you think of yourselves as a small business? Okay, 3 people. Okay, there was about 75 people stood up saying that they were they were part of startups in the room, or 75%, excuse me, of the room. If you're in the business of focusing on startups, you can't be talking about small business. So one of the things I've seen in talking to a lot of corporations is they say, oh yeah, startups, those are small businesses. We've got a small business unit. None of the people that are starting companies here think of themselves as small businesses. They think of themselves as giant businesses that haven't got there yet. So I thought the photo that was up this morning was actually sort of a misdirect, because that little short guy is never going to be that tall guy. But every young company that's here in this room wants to be that giant. Okay, they want to be, they have the ambition to be, they may not get there, right? They may end up being a 25, 30, 40, 50, 200 person shop, which is great because that still drives growth and drives what we're doing. But they all have the ambition to be at that higher level. And so one of the things that we need help with from a startup's perspective is you got to get your voice. When you hear someone say, oh, you're a small business, you got to correct them. No, I'm a startup. I'm focused on this kind of a growth. And so as we travel around the country and we're looking at lots of startup ecosystems, elevating that level up is really key. So what I want to do is I want to open it up, and if you would, I'd love for you guys to go to the mics. So the startups in the room, how many of you guys have had an experience where you've sort of bounced off a large company? You sort of knocked on all the doors because you had a great opportunity to sell them a new solution or a new problem. Would you just come up and quickly tell some of your stories? Anybody volunteers, brave enough to come? Come on, somebody's experienced this. Somebody must sell up. All right, while you're coming up here, and you come on up once you got your hand up, come up to the mic. So I'm going to tell you my story really quickly. So Priceline.com, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to allow airlines to sell the 30% of the seats. 30% of the seats on average go empty on an airline. Now, I know you've all been in overcrowded bumped flights. That's actually an anomaly. It just feels incredibly painful, so you remember it, okay? But roughly 2/3 of the airplane is full, and 1/3 of the airplane of the flights are there. So 2.5 million passengers a day, roughly 2/3 of the capacity. So we went to the airlines. We said, we got news for you. Have I got a deal for you? We can sell those seats. We're going to let the customer name their own price. And then they'll tell you what they want to spend, and you can sell an empty seat that would go otherwise, expiring inventory, a commodity. And the airlines basically hated us. They slammed the doors in our faces. They had no interest in doing this. They viewed it as us taking pricing control away from them. So we had to get into the mindset of that company. And so one of the things that I've learned as an entrepreneur is to really understand how those large companies sort of think. So I'd love to hear your story. I think you came up first and then you. So what are your experiences as a startup going in and talking to those companies?
Well, I've invented am I on here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Squat. I invented a new kind of double auction, and we went to pitch it to Odessa, which is the second largest automotive auction company. And we had the CEO and his 10 top executives, and basically set the room on fire. The CTO said, wow, this is clearly the future. Now, I've got money on my budget I can use for this right now, and we're going to get back to you in 2 weeks, not an hour later. We're still waiting. Turns out that they were a subsidiary of a larger company, and talking to the CEO of Odessa wasn't good enough because the CEO and his minions of the parent company weren't there.
Talking to the wrong person, as it turns out.
Well, yeah, we were talking to people who they seemed like they were willing to reinvent themselves, but their parent company was much more conservative. So that was one experience.
Okay, so finding the right person inside those companies. What was your experience?
We're a small consultancy and have been pitching a network strategy to mobilize their community to a major retailer. And we have an internal champion who wants us to do the work, wants us to just come in and change the way they're marketing and approaching people. But we've been in procurement since April. And their contract is so deep and so wide, it would just cripple us to comply with most of the terms, especially when it comes to technology. One of the provisions in it says we can't use any cloud software, which would just shut us down. And I think it would shut anybody down. So it's just the burden of even just the resources we've been spending to get through the procurement process with them, and our lack of experience in navigating it that's been a struggle.
the bureaucracy inside, but also do they understand that what your product is? Do they sort of get it?
I think so. We've got some people, like I said, inside who really understand what we're doing, and I think are running a bit of interference where they can with our procurement rep, but we make the legal folks nervous.
Do they look at your product as an experiment, or is it something that will add tremendous value immediately to what they're doing?
It depends on who you're talking to. The people that we would actually do the project with see the value and see it as being impactful immediately and its potential to roll across multiple brands within their umbrella, but the legal folks that are reviewing it or the technology folks that are reviewing the accompanying tech build that would need to be done are viewing it as a something new, one-off potential, who knows, maybe not worth the trouble.
Right, so I think the people that you're talking to, so I've built some businesses that sell to large businesses as well. And one of the things that I think about from a startup standpoint is a lot of times you say, well, they're so big that it's a rounding error, right? Like they can experiment with me and it's no big deal. The reality is that that individual is in charge of a business unit, they're in charge of a budget, they're in charge of people, and there's the idea that nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM, and that's all well and good. But until you can position yourself to add value, regardless of their budget, regardless of their charge, that's when people start to take you really seriously. I'm not saying that you're not doing it, but oftentimes startups just say, man, Microsoft should totally just check out what we're doing and it wouldn't even cost them that much money. It's also not worth their time in the day to experiment with that, right? So you need to position yourself. I know that Ben's done a really good job at that. I've got something that's really interesting, but until it shows up on your radar, it's not even worth, experimenting, especially in these times when people are really focusing on core value.
So should we be pitching more to the procurement rather than hoping our internal champion will push us through it?
I think it depends on the organization. Something that Scott and I talk about a lot is, sorry, I'm going back and forth on my mic. Something that Scott and I talk about a lot is the idea that you should be able to identify exactly who you need to speak to within the organization. And we've talked to big companies and we've said, hey, would you be willing to talk to a startup, as a potential vendor with a relationship? And one of the hurdles is, obviously procurement's involved, there's going to be legal, but you need to be able to identify that person. And if you haven't done that research up front, again, that's like, why am I going to waste my time to experiment? So I think you need to look at that organization specifically. If your internal champions aren't doing it and you've been in procurement for how long, maybe you need to find some other triggers to pull, if it's possible. And at the same time, as a startup, you need to look at your resources and your time and say, hey, we've been in procurement for 6 months. Are we modeling against this revenue when we should be able to pick off some smaller stuff? So it's very situational, but it's about finding that right person.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so the question to the large companies in the room, does any of that make sense? Right? And how does that play out? And how do you think about those entrepreneurs that could have unbelievable assets that you're not able to even see? And the procurement question is an interesting one. A lot of large companies, how many of you guys have business development people? Right? They're out scouring the world looking for these large, incredible deals. And then the procurement people, they're just trying to satisfy whatever their demand is, their supply lines. But the supply chain can't listen to unbelievably new ideas for how to do something because they didn't know they needed them. And then the business development people, the deal's just too small. So it comes back again to, as a company, figuring out as a large corporation, how do you engage and interact with the startup ecosystem? All right, next question. How many of the entrepreneurs here have a business that's likely to go global, that has the potential to go international at some point along the way? Just a quick show of hands. Okay. And how many of you are currently international now? Sort of out of the box. So one of the key roles, again, a small handful, but ambition among folks to be able to go international. One of the things that large companies can do a much, much better job of is leveraging their assets as experts in the global marketplace to help startups. So they don't necessarily have to be customers of that startup, they can become partners and deliver a new product or a new service to the marketplace outside. So IBM's one of our partners. IBM's been in Brazil for 97 years. They probably know something about that market, right, that they can sort of help other people with. Microsoft has been selling globally in the software space for decades. There's expertise there that you can tap into. So it's not always partnering as an entrepreneur. As you go to a large company, you don't necessarily have to try to sell them something, right? You can leverage their assets and be able to create a partnership with them to say, hey, how can you help us with a distribution channel? There's another way of sort of partnering with these firms because they have assets to bring. And I bring this up, and we're focused on it here at Thinc Iowa because these corporations are assets within your ecosystem. They're resources that you can leverage. And I thought Ben Milne today did a great job talking about the fact that if you pick up the phone and you're asking for advice or you're looking for mentoring, a lot of these folks will answer. They'll spend the time with you. They'll take the time to have a conversation with you. And they have expertise that they can bring to the table. They also have potential executives that could be investors. They have potential people who have domain knowledge, really deep domain knowledge in the area that you need help in, way more depth than you could possibly ever hire. And Ben talked a lot about that. So connecting with these large companies is really important, even if you're not selling into them. You've got to find ways, especially in an ecosystem like the ones, frankly, that aren't in the Valley or in Boston or Austin, where you need those experts to be at the table because they bring a lot more resources to you. Go ahead.
I have a question. So, okay, we've kind of been talking about the two sides. Actually, Ben showed it's us versus them geographically, but I'm gonna be like Craig, and I'm gonna be like Paige and keep referencing DeWalla here. So, but that graphic was great. Us versus them nationally, but there's also us versus them in terms of big business startup. Like, we're all part of the ecosystem. Every single big business out there, let alone city, was started by an entrepreneur. It was started by like one person or a founding team, right? Not everything was huge originally. So we need to understand that there's this continuum, this spectrum that you run along, and we all want to be at the top end. Some people want to build lifestyle businesses, and that's great. But I have a question. How many entrepreneurs in here, I'm an entrepreneur, would say or have an adverse reaction, and be honest, say, like, would you ever work in corporate? How many of you have ever said, oh, you've totally blown that off and I would never work in corporate? How many of you said that? Raise your hands high if you've done that. All right. So how many of you, and I don't know how many there are that work for big companies, have ever looked at startup or heard some of the folks up here talking and say, that's insane, that's not possible in our culture, that's good, maybe it's okay in the Valley? How many of you have ever had a little bit of that reaction if you work for a big company? So you're lying. So my point is, there's a cultural conditioning that needs to happen. We talk about the split of a lot of our communities or societies. We're talking about upper class, middle class, the whole thing with 1%, 99% right now. I would contend that we almost have like this split in businesses, when in reality it's just a life cycle of a business. And for some reason we have this huge aversion, and I completely respect big companies and making sure that they're vetting people that are coming in, right? So as a startup, there's a lot of entitlement, especially today we're championing entrepreneurship. It's on the tip of everybody's tongue, from the White House to Des Moines, Iowa, right? But the problem is that as a startup, you are not entitled to anybody's contract. You're not entitled to a user's contract on the web, and you're not entitled to IBM's contract. Even if you think you have the best thing in the world, I mean, the day you start playing politics in a big company is the day that you're really dealing with them on like a fundamental level as a customer. And so, we've been talking a lot about startups and championing startups, and I spend my life doing that. But I think a really important message for startups is to start thinking about how I can address this huge potential in revenue, this huge potential in partnerships, and learning more about how those organizations work, putting the time in to study them, putting the time in to understand those networks and who the decision makers are. That means a lot. My startup, my hometown, I'm from the Midwest, I would spend mornings having coffee with everybody running a big business in the city. And they're not even customers, they're not even clients, but I made sure that I understood the environment, I made sure that I understood the community, and they can start to make things happen for you. But you're not entitled to anybody's contract, even if you have something great. You have to start playing in their ball field in order to hit a home run. And a lot of people don't understand that. Hitting a home run in an away field is pretty tough. So you got to be ready to do that, I think.
Yeah, these assets are ones that you got to draw on, and you've got to be able to bring those pieces together. So from a connection standpoint, I'm hoping that when we come back here in a year's time, we'll be able to see many, many more large companies really with a clear focus on startups. And then, as Nick was just describing, how do we help startups get a much better understanding of how they interact with these large firms? Because they are distribution channels. For those of you who are entrepreneurs who aren't working with large companies, you're often in a situation where these are potential distribution partners to get your consumers. Again, just quick show of hands, how many of the entrepreneurs out here are selling direct, have a direct product to a customer, direct customers, out there? These channel partners are huge opportunities. And you've got to figure out how you leverage them, because they help you get to scale much, much faster if you can figure out how to leverage those existing relationships. And they're not all terrifying. So I want to lay the groundwork here, because we've spent the day talking a lot about sort of us versus them. There's big companies and there's young companies. And I thought I'd open it up to see if there are any questions that you have either for Nick or I, and then I have a couple of challenges that I want to post to the audience. And I have no idea what our timing is, so Jeff or somebody else, please let us know when we should wrap things up. But you have a question? Anybody else has questions, please come on up.
Yeah, so so we talk about large corporations, like we can just walk up to the large corporation and ask the question to the right person. So like companies like Sprint, Cerner, Hallmark, all these places in Kansas City. So once you identify something that a large corporation can help you out with, how do you identify who the right person is to go to? You go to a marketing department that has over 1,000 people working for them, or a sales team that has over 1,000 people. Like, who's the right person to go to, and how to identify that from a startup perspective?
So I'll take a cut and then you can add on. So two things. One is it was a lot harder about 15 or 20 years ago to figure that question out. But we have tools like LinkedIn now. They can actually tell you a lot about the social graph within a large company. So that's sort of an asset or a tool to use. And then the second is you got to do your homework. And the first pass is not to actually go and try to figure out who to connect with directly, to go to that one person. It's actually to build a network of support within that company. So the young woman who was up here talking about having a champion, you got to have a network of champions. And you start by just understanding the ecosystem of inside that company. What are the different pieces that work inside a large firm? And then identify the people that you need to have the initial conversations with that can point you in the right direction. And most sales environments and most partnership environments are momentum games. So you got to keep the momentum going. So the fact that the woman was saying is 6 months or since June, that's like, that's weeks and weeks and weeks too long. You got to keep the momentum. So if you got the wrong person, go to the next person and go around the company. But the beauty is, if you start by building that network out at the head end, you don't sort of piss anybody off, because you're not going and saying, I need you to make a decision. You're actually just going and seeking some advice and counsel about this idea that you have.
I think Brian has.
Yeah, good.
I was just going to add, since the Microsoft's been referenced a few times, I just wanted to specifically to that question is that don't also forget that if you build a relationship with a large organization like Microsoft or IBM or Google even, that they also have relationships with we do business with probably every single one of those corporations you just said too. So when we talk to startups, and thankfully Microsoft was smart enough about almost 3 years ago to have an organization that directly interacts with startups, and that's why we're here. But we have those relationships, and Scott said it perfectly. It is probably most of my job, more so than talking about our development tools, but it is about doing PR for startups, getting them engaged with our channels of distribution. That's huge. And I think when people think of Microsoft, it's about, how do we get those free tools? It's about partnering with people like Kaufman and the Startup America partnership to get you access to what we have access to. And it is those large organizations that if there is a connection that we have, or even investors, or people like Nick at Kaufman and Scott with Startup America. So just know that if, we're here for the rest of the evening as well too. So we'd love to make sure if you have questions and we don't know all the answers, that we can help make those connections as well.
Yeah, and I'll briefly just say, I'm a huge proponent of networking with people, and I think organizations are people. There's a big deal made about raising capital right now, right? There's sites dedicated to it. There's, Venture Hacks is something that Kaufman's participated in, and it's become almost an art, right? And there's so much media put around that. But I think it's really interesting to take that art and take it to customer development of a large organization. Everybody says you have to network into a VC, network into capital. Take the same approach into a large organization, and don't make that first ask about selling. Make the first ask about where they're going, what's the strategic direction, what are their pain points, things like that. I know that sounds funny, but again, deal with startups all the time, and there's just this entitlement where I've got something awesome, and you just absolutely need to implement it right now. Here's the API. You know, where am I going? Where's my budget right now? So I want to make sure you get a question in.
How is it strategic? We'll take one more question, then we'll wrap up here. Does that work?
I got two things, and neither are a question, so it'll be quick. There is a startup here in Des Moines called Upward, and Scott, with your airline experience, I think they should probably meet you and shake hands. I was sitting in the back with one of them, so there's a plug, and you should make that connection. I was part of the dot-com telecom fallout 10 years ago of, I'm out of this company, I need to go find a job, I'm going to start a business. I know you're not the IRS, but I look at you and think government. The biggest, probably, yeah, sorry. Probably the biggest expense I had my first year was my tax bill. I would love to see something that allows that first-time entrepreneur, when they go out to make up their first buck, that the government gives them a break that first year and allows them then to grow and reinvest that money in themselves.
So I just want to reiterate, not government at all. I think we have this problem. Anytime we hear the word America, we think government in this country, and that's a really big problem. The other thing I would say to that is, yes, that would be really cool. There's a lot of, it's not government's job to create jobs, right? But it's government's job to create conditions that we can all create jobs. And so that's something I really believe in. I actually got that quote from Rahm Emanuel last week in Chicago at Chicago Ideas Week. But interestingly enough, we were at Inc. 500 a couple weeks ago. We did this like little poll. We asked people, what are the biggest hindrances for you to start or grow your company in the next year? I totally thought it was going to be the economic condition, taxes, everything like that. Guess what the top one was? Finding the best people. So I know that's ominous. I know you think like, oh man, I'm going to have to deal with these taxes and since I have revenue. But I would challenge you to go out there and focus on building the company, the product, and value. Those things will work themselves out. Does the government need to look at some of those things? Probably. But those aren't things that we can control right now. The only thing we can control is starting a business and building it. So
I knew I brought him up here for a reason. So again, I want to reiterate that I think the idea is an important one, and there's a lot of changes from a regulation standpoint, and there's a lot of things moving down the pipeline to help address some of those issues. But you've got to build your business kind of no matter what comes at you. And yeah, it would be nice if things were different, but we're focused at Startup America, and I would encourage all of you to focus on building an unbelievably valuable business, almost in spite of the stuff that's in the way, those headwinds that are there. Because if it's not that headwind, it's something else. It's just welcome to being an entrepreneur and welcome to starting a company. So I want to wrap with two challenges. So my first challenge is to the corporations in the room, and that is that Microsoft, GE, Dell, and a few other companies have stepped up recently, and we announced something called the Startup Corporate Connection. And it's a partnership with large corporations around the country that can help open channels for Startup America firms. So I encourage the corporations that are here, if you're interested in that, I'd love to talk to you more about it. But the whole idea is to try to address some of the pain points that young companies have at accessing large firms. And they involve access to exports, access to talent inside the corporation, expertise, and strategic partnerships, and the kinds of things that we've talked about. So please, if you're a large company, come see me. I'll be around for a couple hours this evening. The second challenge is that we recently started inviting startups from around the country to join Startup America. It's totally free to join. There's about $1 billion worth of resources to come have access to, a variety of different types, mostly from some of the large companies in the country, but also from other startups, helping other startups. It's free to join. There are 3 startups in Iowa who have signed up for Startup America. There are 166 in California. So here's my challenge. I'd like the help of Silicon Prairie News and the help of the people in the audience here. I'd like to see if Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri, sort of the catchment base of Silicon Prairie, to blow away California by the end of the month. So my challenge for you is, let's get more startups representing. And the reason that's so important is that we need to show the entire country that there's unbelievable startups all around the United States doing amazing things, and the only way we can do that is we have visibility on it. If I didn't come here, I probably would have never seen Ben. I might not have met him for another year or 2 years until his business got so big that it became a much, much larger enterprise, and at no fault of Ben's. But we've got to elevate the success stories around the country to a whole nother level. And the only way we can do that is we have visibility on them. So my challenge for you is let's blow the doors out of California. Let's show that there's unbelievable startups happening all around the country. And I look forward to coming back when we figure out how to get Startup Iowa off the ground. So thanks, everybody.